This is a story about grief, survival, and how a broken man discovers that the place he feared most was the only place that could teach him how to live again. Callum Thorne had spent 3 long years drifting through life like the hollow shape of the man he once was, moving forward only because stopping hurt worse, and the only thing that gave him purpose anymore was the quiet, lonely work of tracking lost or stolen horses across lands other riders avoided. Which was exactly how he ended up entering a canyon that felt alive with wrongness, its walls rising like jagged teeth around him, swallowing sound and sunlight until even the air tasted like a warning he ignored, because going back meant returning to a house full of silence, heavy enough to crush him, silence haunted by the memories of Sarah and Emitha, wife and daughter, lost to a fire he had been too far away to stop, a fire that had turned him into a man who breathed out of habit rather than desire. The hoofprints he followed were deliberate, light, almost taunting, leading him deeper into a place men whispered about around fires but never entered alone. Yet Callum kept going because nothing waited for him back home except empty rooms and empty days. When he spotted a strip of faded cloth tied to a branch marker placed too perfectly to be accident, he felt a tug of instinct telling him to turn back. But instinct was for men who cared whether they lived or died. The arrow hit the dirt by his boot without warning, silent and precise, and Callum raised his hands calmly before his horse even finished rearing. Because he'd already seen them, women dozens emerging from rocks and shadows with the smooth coordination of predators, armed with bows, blades, rifles older than he was but clearly cared for, their expressions steady, unreadable, and filled with a purpose that left no room for fear. Their leader stepped forward like water finding its path, tall, strong, dark hair braided tight, scars writing ancient stories across her skin, eyes sharp enough to cut through whatever shields Callum still had left. You followed those horses a long way for a man who rides alone, she said, her voice cold and clear. They're mine, he answered. Everything here is ours. She signaled to warriors, and they bound him with quick, practiced hands, warning him that cooperation meant dying tomorrow, and resistance meant dying today. They marched him through twisting passages until the canyon opened into a hidden village gardens, fires, sturdy homes, and everywhere he looked, only women and girls, not a single man in sight. They tied him to a weathered post at the camp's center, ropes pulling his arms back until he felt the first bite of pain that would deepen long before sunrise. The leader crouched in front of him, eyes searching his face for something she didn't name. My name is Kimmy Mella, she said softly. You stay here tonight. At dawn, we decide your fate. She stepped back, pausing only to add, those horses you followed weren't stolen, they were invited, just like you. When she walked away, leaving him alone beneath a darkening sky and 100 watchful eyes, Callum felt a strange shift. Inside himself, not fear, not hope, but the unsettling realization that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone with his own ghosts. He was surrounded by theirs. True strength is not measured by weapons or walls, but by the courage to face what you fear within yourself. Callum barely slept, not because the ropes cut into his wrists, or because the ground beneath him was cold and unforgiving, but because The village around him breathed with a strange, unsettling life. Fires crackled, shadows moved, and every whisper carried the weight of secrets older than anything he had known. He sat tied to the post at the village's center, an outsider surrounded by dozens of sharp-eyed warrior women who watched him not with hate, but with a quiet, controlled suspicion that made his skin prickle. As dawn finally began to wash the canyon in pale gold, the sounds of morning rose around him: grinding stones, soft footsteps, muted laughter of children running past him without fear, and the steady rhythm of life that felt strangely normal, a normal that didn't match the arrows aimed at him last night. When the first light touched his boots, Kimimela returned, her presence cutting through the air like a blade. She moved with the confidence of someone who carried both burden and authority. "You lived the night," she said simply, studying him with unreadable eyes. "Some don't." Callum held her gaze, refusing to show the exhaustion pulling at him. "I wasn't planning on dying tied to a pole," he replied. Kimmy's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered approval, maybe, or curiosity. She ordered the ropes cut, and 2 warriors loosened the knots with quick, efficient hands. Callum stretched his stiff arms, wincing. "Don't think freedom means safety," Kimmy warned. "You're not free, not yet." She led him through the village, and the more he saw, the more the place confused him. Women training with old but well-kept rifles, others tending gardens, weaving cloth, teaching young girls to shoot arrows with frightening precision. There was no chaos here, no fear, no uncertainty, just ordered, deliberate, disciplined, almost sacred. Finally, she stopped before a long wooden structure built against the canyon wall. "This is where the council meets. You'll enter, speak truth, and hope they believe you." She stepped close, lowering her voice. "Lie, and you won't walk back out." Callum met her gaze with steady eyes. "I've got nothing worth lying about." She studied him again, that same searching look she had given him last night, as if trying to read the scars carved into his soul. Then she pushed open the door. Inside, 7 elder women sat around a fire pit, each marked with symbols painted in ash across their arms. They questioned him ruthlessly: how he found the canyon, why he followed their horses, what his intentions were, who waited for him outside. Callum answered honestly, though each answer seemed to shock them more. When he mentioned his wife and daughter, the room fell silent, the elders sharing a heavy, unspoken look. Finally, the eldest rose. "A man carrying death in his heart is dangerous," she said. "But a man seeking nothing has nothing to betray." She turned to Kimmy. "He stays, he serves, and he earns his water." Kimmy bowed her head, accepting the decision. Callum didn't understand what any of that meant. As she escorted him out, he finally asked, "So what happens now?" She looked at him with eyes that held both warning and something almost softer. "Now," she said, "you survive, or you don't. The canyon decides." And as the sun climbed higher, Callum felt an unfamiliar sensation rising inside him: not fear, not anger, but the first spark of something he thought had died with his family, a reason to keep breathing. Facing your own past honestly is the first step toward understanding others and earning trust. Callum's wrists throbbed where the ropes had cut into his skin. But the pain wasn't the first thing he noticed. It was the silence that followed. The council meeting. Women moved around him with quiet efficiency, yet none interfered with his presence, though all eyes lingered, measuring, judging, weighing. For the first time in years, Callum realized he was being seen not as a man who had lost everything, not as a threat, but as someone whose choices, no matter how grim, carried meaning. He had survived the night, endured questioning, and now remained here because they had decided he could. Whether that meant trust or just temporary tolerance, he didn't know. Kimmy Mella returned at midday, carrying nothing but a bow across her back and a calm authority that demanded attention. She crouched beside him, her shadow falling across the ground. Most men would have begged, she said softly, her eyes holding his, or lied, or tried to bargain with what they think we want. Callum didn't flinch. I've done none of that, he said quietly. The corners of her mouth lifted in the faintest flicker of approval. She leaned closer. Then speak truth. Why did you follow those horses? The question was simple, yet heavy. Callum's throat tightened as the past pressed in the fire, the smoke, the screams, the futile attempts to save his family. He swallowed, letting words fall carefully. They were mine, he said, not because of greed, but because they were all I had left that reminded me of what I once had. My home, my life, it's gone, and chasing them, I didn't care if I died. Nothing back home mattered, nothing. Kimmy listened in silence, but her stillness felt like an invitation. Around them, the women nearby unconsciously edged closer, drawn by the weight of his confession. He continued, voice steady but heavy. Fire, Sarah, Emma. I was too far away. I tried to save them. Couldn't. I buried them with my own hands. Lived alone for 6 months in a house that smelled of ashes and loss. Sold most of it. Kept the horses because they didn't remind me of anything else. I existed. Nothing more. His words hung between them, trembling in the space where truth met understanding. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a young girl, barely more than 16, stepped forward. Her face streaked with tears, yet she held herself as if the world demanded bravery from her small shoulders. She placed her hand on his arm, squeezing with delicate firmness. "Thank you," she whispered. And Callum felt more in that small gesture than in hours of threats or interrogation. Kimmy finally stood, moving around him to organize the camp's women back into their routines, but she paused before leaving. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating, lingered on him. "Truth is heavier than ropes," she said quietly, "but it binds you in a different way. Survive, and you may learn what it really means to be seen." Callum let the weight of her words settle. For the first time, survival wasn't just about escaping death. It was about understanding a world he had never known, a world that demanded strength, honesty, and a willingness to stand when everything inside wanted to collapse. By evening, he was allowed to move freely within the camp, though eyes followed him everywhere he went. He repaired fences, tended small tasks, and realized slowly that each act, no matter how mundane, changed the perception of him. Children peeked curiously. Warriors acknowledged his presence without interference. And even the younger girls treated him with a tentative respect he hadn't earned in the usual ways. Every swing of a hammer, every knot tied in rope, every careful glance at the camp's rhythm was a lesson in survival that went beyond fear. It was a lesson in belonging, in being recognized, and perhaps in being trusted. And as the canyon night fell again, Callum held the quiet truth. Survival wasn't merely keeping breath, in his lungs. It was being part of something bigger, learning from women whose lives had been carved by loss and danger, and discovering that even a man broken by grief could find a place where his actions, his honesty, his courage meant more than fear ever could. Courage isn't only in facing enemies, in choosing to act when doing nothing is easier. The sun dipped behind the canyon walls, painting the village in shades of amber and red, as Callum realized that surviving the council's judgment was only the beginning. The true test of his place here had yet to come. Kimimela approached him again, silent as a shadow, her presence enough to still even the restless children and the whispering elders. "You've been seen," she said, her voice carrying that same edge of authority, tempered by faint acknowledgement. "Now you will act. Survival is not enough. We need proof you understand what it means to protect what matters." Callum's stomach tightened. He had been ready to die a dozen times in the past few days, but now the challenge was not death, it was responsibility. The weight of others' lives pressing down on him with more intensity than fear alone ever could. The test revealed itself slowly. Distant howls pierced the canyon air, first faint, then growing closer, deliberate and measured. Wolves, a pack. Callum's instincts, honed from years of ranch work and tracking, snapped to life. He jerked his head, alert, muscles coiled, every sense sharpened in ways only a man who had lived and lost could manage. The women sprang into motion around him, grabbing weapons, positioning themselves around structures, herding children with practiced efficiency. Fires flared higher, casting walls of light meant to confuse and repel the predators. Callum's body remembered what his mind had nearly forgotten. He yanked at the ropes, still partially binding him, cutting his wrists raw, ignoring the burn. "They're circling from the east," he shouted, voice cracking through adrenaline. "Your fire line has a gap near the supply tent. Wolves will hit there first." Kimmy spun toward him, bow drawn, suspicion giving way to trust in an instant as she assessed the truth of his words. "How do you know?" she asked, urgency lacing her tone. "Because that's where your scent trails are weakest and shadows run deepest. That's where I'd attack if I were them." Orders barked in her native language. 3 warriors sprinted to the eastern perimeter, slipping into position just as gray shapes emerged from darkness, eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. Callum tore the post with everything he had left in his body, feeling ropes cut into raw skin, bleeding, muscles screaming, but he continued, positioning himself to shield a trembling girl from the largest wolf. The moment was chaos, teeth snapping, arrows flying, women shouting, children crying. Yet amidst it all, Callum acted without hesitation, each movement precise, born of years defending livestock and living in the shadow of death. A wolf lunged toward the girl, jaws snapping inches from her throat. Callum thrust a spear he barely held into its path, impaling it with force that sent the rest of the pack scattering. Arrows from the women followed, deadly and perfect, until the threat receded into the pre-dawn shadows. Silence fell, thick and deliberate, broken only by the rasp of Callum's breath and the crackle of fires. The girl, Takakota, the same one who had watched him with tear-streaked cheeks days before, approached him cautiously, hand trembling as she placed it on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. And for the first time in years, Callum understood the weight of his own survival. It was not for himself anymore. It was proof of what he could do for others, the first step in earning the trust of people who had every reason to hate him. Kimimela approached as sunlight crept over the canyon, extending a hand to help him stand. "You could have run," she said quietly. "You were free. You had weapons. You could have disappeared into darkness." Callum shook his head. "I could, but for the first time in years, my survival mattered because it meant someone else lived too." Her gaze lingered, something unspoken passing between them, a flicker of respect, a recognition that actions, truth, and courage carried weight beyond mere existence. As the pack disappeared, the village resumed its rhythm, but Callum felt a subtle shift in the way women watched him, no longer a prisoner, not yet fully trusted, but a man who had chosen responsibility over escape. And in that choice, he realized that the path back to life was not in solitude, was in proving that even a man who had lost everything could still stand and protect. True belonging is earned through action, respect, and understanding the lives of those around. Dawn broke over the canyon with a quiet gold that seemed almost unreal after the chaos of the night. Callum's wrists throbbed, and his shoulders ached from hours bound and fighting. Yet he moved among the camp with a new awareness, no longer merely a survivor. He now felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his chest in a way that reminded him he was not alone. Women moved around him, tending fires, repairing damage from the wolf attack, tending gardens, and preparing food, glancing occasionally at him not with suspicion, but with measured observation. Every look carried a question, a test, a measure of how he would act if the unexpected arose again. Ayasha, a skilled young woman with eyes like steel, approached him carrying a bundle of rope and freshly cut wood. She dropped them at his feet without ceremony. "The corral fence needs repair," she said plainly. "Do you know how to work with your hands?" Callum nodded. "I do." Her eyes held his, reading for honesty. "Then prove your worth. Show that you're more than words and survival." It was a challenge, yet also an offer and acknowledgement that he could belong, but only if he acted. Hours passed as Callum worked, each knot tied, each plank fitted, each repair made became a quiet statement of intent. The women nearby watched, without speaking, their presence not threatening, but ensuring he understood that his actions mattered. Takakota approached cautiously, stepping to the edge of the corral, her eyes still shadowed by the memory of last night's near-death. She observed, learning as he worked, absorbing skill and patience in silence. By midday, Kimimela returned, walking among the workers with her usual quiet authority. She didn't touch him, didn't speak immediately, but her eyes held the subtle shift of acknowledgement. She had seen his endurance, his willingness to contribute without complaint or request for reward. Callum felt it, that invisible evaluation that determined whether he was a man who belonged or merely survived. Later, Nasha, the camp's healer, approached to tend his wounds. She worked with quiet efficiency, hands steady, applying salve that stung briefly before numbing the pain. "You could have left the girl," she said softly, almost to herself. "But you didn't. Most men use chaos as opportunity to escape. Most men don't understand that running from one place only brings emptiness somewhere else." Callum met her eyes, understanding the depth behind her words. It was not praise, it was recognition, the kind that forged bonds stronger than words. As afternoon waned, Takakota returned, holding a small carved wooden horse. "My father made this," she said, handing it to him. "I want you to have it. To remember that some men can still be worth knowing." Callum felt the weight of it, not wood, but meaning, the unspoken acknowledgement that he had begun earning trust, respect, and perhaps, for the first time in years, a sense of belonging. Kimimela found him again as the sun neared the canyon's edge. "The council has deliberated," she said, without preamble. "You've earned the right to stay as long as you prove useful and respectful. Tonight, one final test awaits." She did not explain. She simply turned, leaving him with the lingering warmth of a sunset painting canyon walls in gold and red, holding a child's carved horse, and understanding that survival was no longer just about breathing. It was about purpose, about protecting, contributing, and proving that even a man scarred by loss could find a place among those who had endured far worse. Callum looked around the camp, watching women work, children play cautiously, and elders observe quietly. Each movement told him a story of resilience, of unspoken rules and strength forged through hardship. And in that moment, he understood, to belong, he would need to act again, and perhaps, in doing so, he could finally start to live, not just survive. True courage and belonging come when one chooses to stand for others, even when freedom is within reach. Night fell across the canyon, stretching shadows over the village that had become Callum's unexpected home. The carved horse from Takakota lay in his palm, its worn surface a reminder that even the smallest acts carry meaning. The women moved silently, preparing him for what Kimimela had described only as the final test. The air smelled of sage and smoke, the scent of fires burning higher than usual, as though the canyon itself held its breath. A dozen women emerged from the darkness, their movements precise, predatory, and deliberate. They circled him like wolves, hunting prey, eyes sharp, muscles coiled. Callum's heart pounded, but he remained still, forcing his breathing steady, letting instinct guide him without panic. He knew the test wasn't just about strength or skill, it was about proving himself to a people who had learned to trust no man completely. Kimimela stepped forward, bow drawn, eyes piercing through the firelight. "You've proven you can protect," she said, voice low and deliberate. "Now prove you can submit, trust us, respect us, understand the world we've built without destroying it." Her words were simple, but layered with danger, challenge, and expectation. Callum nodded slowly, understanding the subtle meaning behind them. Obedience was not weakness, but acknowledgement of a system stronger than any one man. The circle tightened. Women advanced, testing his reflexes, observing every micro-movement. Spears, knives, and arrows pointed toward him, not to kill, but to measure his responses. Callum moved carefully, trusting instincts he had honed through years of survival, adjusting posture, distributing weight, signaling awareness without aggression. Each step, each subtle motion became a silent dialogue with the women surrounding him, a language without words, measured by reaction and trust. Hours passed in this tense choreography. Sweat stung his eyes, muscles screamed from fatigue, and the raw wounds on his wrists throbbed, but Callum remained focused. He noticed subtle signs, the twitch of a brow, a shift in stance, a deliberate pause, and mirrored, respected, responded. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the circle loosened. The women lowered their weapons just slightly, their eyes still vigilant, but their posture less rigid. The test was not about defeating them. It was about showing he could exist among them without forcing fear, without disrupting the delicate balance of their world. Finally, Kimimela stepped close, gaze steady, bow lowered. "You have passed," she said quietly. Relief, respect, and acknowledgement radiated from her stance. The surrounding women mirrored her, returning to their positions, but with glances that carried something new: acceptance. Callum lowered himself to his knees, exhausted but unbroken, the weight of the past 3 years pressing down. Then, lifting in subtle increments, dawn crept into the canyon again, painting the walls gold and red. Kimimela extended her hand, helping him stand. "You could have walked away," she said softly. "You had your freedom. You had weapons. You could have disappeared while we fought the wolves, while we tested you. But you stayed. You protected, you respected, and you endured." Callum met her gaze, understanding for the first time in years that being needed could be more powerful than freedom itself. Around him, the camp resumed its rhythm. Children played under watchful eyes, warriors trained, elders observed, and Callum understood that he had earned a place not because he was invincible, but because he had chosen to act, to stand, and to respect the people who had already survived far more than any man ever should. The carved wooden horse lay in his palm, a symbol of trust, of acknowledgement, and of a life slowly regaining meaning. He had faced fire, wolves, and the judgment of those who had learned to survive without Menand. He had survived, but more importantly, he had learned what it meant to live again. For the first time in 3 years, Callum felt it: belonging, responsibility, and the fragile, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, some losses could lead to something greater than despair.